Hi, my name is Eleanor Breen. I'm the Deputy Director for Archaeology here at Mount Vernon, and with me is Dr. Esther White. She's our Director for Historic Preservation and Research. People often associate George Washington with Mount Vernon, of course, but Mount Vernon was also home to an enslaved community whose numbers rose to over 300 individuals by the year of Washington's death in 1799. And one of the ways that we know about that community is through the archaeological record, excavations that have occurred over the years. And one site stands out, that being the House for Families slave quarter. Excavations occurred there in the 1980s and early 1990s. And today, Esther and I are going to be talking about some of the exciting finds from that archaeological excavation.
So let's look at this artifact that we've got. This is a pair of brass, what we used to call cufflinks. They were excavated in 1985 in the House for Families cellar, and I know when we cataloged them, we thought that they were probably used by the male slaves, perhaps on their livery or costumes that they wore when they were serving in the house, and they would have functioned as cufflinks do today to hold their sleeves together. And I know that 25 years later, we don't necessarily think that anymore, right, Eleanor?
Right. There's been a lot of research done on this category of buttons called linked buttons that suggests that they were widely available, that they were perhaps very cheap and allowed individuals who purchased them and put them on their clothing, whether they were at their sleeve or around their neck, to stay abreast of fashion changes. And so they were really a way to take the button off of the cloth and put it on another shirt, and offered a degree of interchangeability and attunement to fashion. We have two artifacts in front of us now. One is the bowl of a clay tobacco pipe. So you would have stuffed your tobacco in this end, and it would have had a longer stem from which you would have smoked. The other artifact is a marble, and when these were first excavated and cataloged in the 80s, they were considered indicative of slave leisure, or what we might better call non-work hours. Enslaved individuals had a little bit of freedom during the time that they weren't serving in the fields or in the kitchen, for example, but there were certain restrictions on how they could spend that time. And in the ensuing years, we've sort of broadened out from that interpretation, right?
That's right. The marble is made of clay, and we find lots of those in the slave quarter and places where folks lived. And we oftentimes, I think of them specifically as childhood games, right, Eleanor? Mm-hmm. But we don't necessarily know that marbles weren't enjoyed by everybody in the slave quarter who's living there. And so I think that item is still very much a non-work sort of leisure time activity. But the tobacco pipe, I know, has kind of gone through a transformation over the years. When we first cataloged it, we really thought of tobacco pipes as something that were enjoyed by slaves when they weren't working. And now? And recent research into the documentary side of things suggests that there were possibly two lengths of pipe stems available, and that Washington purchased from England. There were long-stemmed pipes, perhaps for sitting around the dining room, and they were ordered in such quantities that perhaps Washington and the guests at Mount Vernon used those. But then he orders much higher quantities of short pipes, also called hunter's pipes. And those are in quantities that could have served the household and perhaps even the enslaved community. And so Washington may have been giving those pipes to slaves as part of special provisions. And certainly the shorter pipes could have been smoked inside the House for Families slave quarter, or even while folks were carrying out their assigned duties. Do we have any idea if this was a long-stemmed pipe or a short-stemmed pipe?
That's a good question. If you look at the mark on the bowl, you'll see a WM. We think that that's a maker named William Manby. Washington actually gets his short pipes from a pipe provider and a pipe maker named Edward Manby, and we think that this might be his brother. And so that is at least a little bit of evidence that this might have been a short-stemmed pipe. And some of our recent research has been into really systematically measuring the stems of pipes to see if we can somehow figure that out from other metrics as well.
So here we have a piece of white salt glaze stoneware. It's a type of ceramic that's coming from England during the 18th century. And this is part of a plate that has what we call a dot diaper and basket motif molded into the rim of the plate. And this type of ceramic is really exciting here at Mount Vernon because we know not only when George Washington was ordering an entire set of white salt glaze stoneware for his dining room table, but by finding these pieces of these plates in the House for Families, we think that we were able to document the handing down of this type of ceramic from the mansion where George Washington and Martha Washington are getting a brand new set of more fashionable china called creamware and passing their older white salt glaze stoneware down to the slave quarter. That's one of the sort of very exciting finds that we discovered in the 1990s, and I think that with the reanalysis that we're doing, we're hoping to really build on that in lots of exciting ways, right, Eleanor?
Right, so we're going to be thinking about, with our reanalysis of this assemblage over the next 2 years, all of the different ways that slaves had access to items of material culture. So handing down and special provisions are, certainly part of the story. There are other informal ways that slaves had access to goods, perhaps by trading amongst themselves, their family members on the outlying farms. They also entered the formal economy by going to local stores and making purchases on their own behalf of items. So perhaps in the ceramic assemblage we'll see evidence of that as well. The artifacts that we have in front of us now are what archaeologists classify as faunal remains, or animal bones. So this is the scapula or shoulder bone for a pig, and this here is the femur or the thigh bone of a deer. And so we chose these two artifacts to discuss because what we see here are evidence probably of provisions or rations given to the slaves by George Washington. So he provisioned meat and also fish and cornmeal, so a starch product. But one of the biggest discoveries from the House for Families slave quarter animal bone assemblage is that the enslaved community was not only receiving provisions but also supplementing their diet by hunting and fishing and even growing products in the garden. And so that's the evidence of the deer here is evidence of hunting, of actually going out and catching their own food, either to supplement their nutrition or just add a little bit of variety to their daily diets. But there's going to be some future research hopefully happening with these faunal remains.
There is going to be some future research. The House for Families, we excavated more than 25,000 animal bones. And so when we found these in the 80s and 90s, this really was a very important, it remains a very important collection of faunal remains, or diet information about what the enslaved community is eating. And the rap has always been that the slaves in a slave quarter, and this is not just at Mount Vernon but all over, that they were taking whatever the master had given them, whatever they were provisioned, and then adding in wild game or vegetables that they may have grown or have traded for, putting them all into one pot that could then simmer all day long while they were doing their work. And when they would come home at night, kind of like our crock pot, it was very easy to get your meal. These meals were typically thought of as stews or maybe very lumpy, soupy kinds of things, and they were eaten out of bowls rather than, off of plates. And one of the things that we want to do with this reanalysis of all this material is look and see, do we have good evidence for these one-pot meals, and can we really support that through the archaeological record, or is this something that perhaps we've just kind of created as a nice story of what the enslaved community are doing with this wide variety of food remains? These are just some of the thousands of artifacts that were excavated from the House for Families in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And one of the things that we're hoping to do is to continue the research on them, because what they've shown us is how complex and how deep the story of slavery is, especially here at Mount Vernon.